From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
America's credit rating gets a downgrade as several House Republicans from blue states threaten to hold up a GOP tax bill unless it expands the deduction for state and local taxes paid. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. On Tuesday, Fitch Ratings, the rating agency, said it was downgrading U.S. debt from AAA to AA+. And here's the response from the Biden administration, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen.
Fitch's decision is puzzling in light of the economic strength we see in the United States. I strongly disagree with Fitch's decision, and I believe it is entirely unwarranted. Its flawed assessment is based on outdated data and fails to reflect improvements across a range of indicators, including those related to governance, that we've seen over the past 2.5 years.
Kim, what do you make of that response, and what did Fitch actually say when it announced this downgrade?
Well, I don't know where Janet Yellen has been living for the last few years or even the past few decades, because this has been coming for a long time. Look, we had another such moment back in 2011, back at that moment when we were having a clash between former House Speaker John Boehner and President Barack Obama over a debt ceiling deal. But at that point, Standard & Poor's dropped its AAA rating. The other two credit raters kept theirs where they were. Things actually looked pretty good back then by comparison to how things look now. I mean, for example, back then, U.S. debt held by the public as compared to GDP was about 65%, which is already a scary number. It's now expected to be about 98.2% this year, up from 79.4% just before the pandemic, and it's expected to hit 115% of GDP by 2033. And, this is a reflection, as Fitch said, of ongoing problems with growing national debt and growing general government debt burden, which is putting enormous pressure, for instance, on the amount of money that we have to pay every year as a share of the budget simply in interest payments. None of this is sustainable. And I think if I were Fitch, the thing that would be most alarming is that despite this worsening situation, the public officials in Washington, as reflected by Janet Yellen there, seem oblivious to the overspending that is causing this and have no plan for fixing it.
I would point to the 2023 long-term budget outlook put out by the Congressional Budget Office. I know this is a little light reading for a Friday afternoon, but this is the life that we've chosen, Mene. Here is the actual numbers for 2022. Revenues, about 20% of GDP, outlays 25%. And those numbers, it looks like, are only getting worse from here. Here's the projection for 2043. Revenues, 18.6% of GDP, outlays 26.7%. And some of that is these entitlement programs for old age, Social Security, Medicare. We have fewer workers than we used to. Those figures, those birth trends do not seem to be reversing themselves. And there is a refusal to deal with that problem and to tell the public the truth and tell voters that these programs are going to have to be reformed, and not for people who are in them right now, or not even necessarily people who are close to retirement age, but for people who are my age and your age.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can look at the pie chart, the breakdown of U.S. spending, which of course is the source of this debt that led to the U.S. downgrade. And the vast majority of it, more than 2/3, goes to entitlement spending every year. That's programs like Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. And the math for all of those programs just seems to be getting worse by the year. As you pointed out, we're about to have the biggest wave of retirees in the history of this country as the baby boomers start to age into retirement. At the same time, we aren't growing our workforce nearly as quickly as we used to. Workforce participation within the past few months has started to tick up again, but it's way down compared to the historic trend. And we also have much less immigration than we have had in past years. That could be news to who are used to hearing about the border crisis and the number of people coming illegally, but the number of people arriving in this country legally and staying and obtaining work is down over recent years compared with where it was. And so we have fewer workers paying payroll taxes into a system as we have more retirees coming. And yet the politics of this problem are becoming worse. I can remember when I was young and first starting to pay attention to these sorts of political questions, there was some effort to create a consensus around reforming entitlements. You had the Simpson-Bowles Commission. The idea was that Republicans and Democrats would move together, and so they would both bear the political cost of trying to come up with a workable solution to put entitlements on a better footing. Of course, that didn't amount to anything lasting or substantial. And since then, you've had not only Democrats saying that there's no way that they're going to sign on to any sort of reform, but Republicans even have backed away, and that's mostly because of the influence of Donald Trump. His 2016 primary victory was in part because he was very vigorously defending entitlements as they are and basically making demagogic arguments against anyone who suggested that this was a long-term problem that would need a difficult solution. And now we can see that Republican primary candidates are afraid to say anything about the question because they know that they'll bear the ire of Trump and that wing of the Republican Party. And so the odds of any kind of near-term solution to fix the entitlement problem seem to have decreased.
A couple other thoughts here. One is that Janet Yellen is citing improvements in governance over the last couple of years and investments in order to improve America's competitiveness as a reason that Fitch did not need to make this move. And that, Kim, I find a little bit humorous because what she's talking about is spending bills.
Hilarious.
And if that's the solution to get our spending and debt problem out of control, I find that circle hard to square. The other thing that I think is interesting is this debate about these standoffs. So here's a piece of the explanation from Fitch. It's citing the last 2 decades that has manifested in repeated debt limit standoffs and last-minute resolutions. And Kim, I wonder what you make of that, because we have seen these repeated fights in Congress that are resolved in the last hours or the last days. And it's not that I think that that is a great way to run a railroad, but that does seem to be the only leverage point that causes anybody in Congress to turn off the spending spigots a little bit. And you can go look at the last one that happened. This was in May, this debt ceiling standoff, and Republicans held out and got some caps on discretionary spending that are going to be below inflation.
Well, first of all, just one note on the Janet Yellen comment on governance. I mean, this is where the use of magical wording gets you, because for a long time, we all understood that spending was spending. Democrats thought they'd be clever a while back and recategorize that spending as investments in the country. And clearly, some people actually buy into that nonsense, the notion that somehow spending is an investment. It's just spending. And it's the reason that our fiscal balance sheet looks so bad. But yeah, this was my one complaint with the Fitch language is they suggested that one of the reasons they needed to do this was because of standoffs over the debt ceiling. And the reality is everyone understands the debt ceiling is going to get raised one way or another. There's also all kinds of emergency procedures the Treasury Department can take to continue paying the bills. There's prioritization schemes if they need to do it. But the threat of that kind of pain on the Treasury Department and upset in normal government function has in past been proved a reason for Democratic administrations in particular. The last time again that in this happened was 2011 when Obama was president. Boehner did get some big spending caps. They were forwarded a bit by Paul Ryan, some similar situations. But also, as you note, this spring, when Republicans told the Biden administration, you have got to cut off the spigots. And remember, for months, the Biden administration, not only had they done years of spending blowouts, spending unlike this country had ever seen before, but they were insisting they would not bend and do anything, give any spending concessions in the debt ceiling deal. That turned out to be a situation where Republicans called their bluff, and we are getting a small bit of spending restraint. Now, watch this space. And maybe this Fitch warning comes at a good time because you already have people on both sides of the aisle scheming over how they can unravel some of those caps. You've got Democrats angry that Republicans are cutting even more than what was called for in the deal out of their appropriations bills. But again, I think that this downgrade ought to get everybody closer together for the need to do some dramatic stuff here soon to deal with this balance sheet problem.
Well, Monet, I think that's a great argument, but I see very little evidence in Congress that this is going to be a breakthrough for anybody in this conversation about spending. I think we're going to have to get a lot closer to a crisis, but the problem is you don't know when that kind of crisis is going to arrive. And it's not necessarily that the United States is going to default on its debt. That seems pretty unlikely, but it could change the United States' borrowing costs, which are already pretty high. Here's a figure from the Journal's editorial on the Fitch downgrade. It says interest on the debt this year is expected to be $663 billion. And that is a pretty big number in a Congress where you have knockdown, drag out fights over adding or cutting spending of $1 billion or $2 billion here or there on this or that program.
I do think that it's very clear that you really only see the movement towards cutting future spending when we do have the recurring debt ceiling increases. Other than that, even the Republican Party has shown less willingness in recent years than it historically had to use its leverage to reduce spending. And we've already seen borrowing costs increase over the past few months as the Federal Reserve has increased interest rates. And everyone expects that period to linger for at least the next few coming years. And so that means that all of the additional spending that the government is already pledged to do is going to be taking place at a much higher rate of borrowing. But the political will, exactly as you said, just doesn't seem to be there. And you can see that sort of very widely, that now and then you'll have legislators propose long-term reform plans and try to build a consensus, but very few candidates seeking the presidency are willing to say that they're going to dedicate political capital to solving this problem. And that's because there's a consensus around spending, and any sort of bare reform that would actually sort of curb the long-term spending projection for the country is very easy to attack.